Hey, class, I hope everybody's doing okay. Uh, Today is October the 5th, 2020, in the year of COVID. Um, Today we're going to do chapter 6 for Texas History 2301. And it will be, I don't know what chapter it is in your textbook because I just have it. So let's just call it Texas, the 28th state in the Union, and the lecture will cover 1845 to 1861. Um, if I'm not too worn out, then I will go ahead and do the Civil War. If you're wondering what this is, uh, I got a tattoo a little while ago. My daughter is a tattoo artist, and she came over and she drew a tattoo, and I'll maybe I'll put a picture of it of it later on or something. Okay, so let's get started. So when we left, we were talking about what was going to happen to Texas, and remember, the resolution to annex Texas was being held back, but in a political move, not Zachary Taylor, John Tyler steals uh, James K. Polk's thunder and annexes Texas. Now, the complete entering into the Union doesn't happen until Polk is in office. And then Polk, of course, is going to get the Oregon Territory. And then later on, he's going to wage a war against Mexico, which we're going to talk about here briefly, to take the Mexican secession away from uh, Mexico, which would be what we argued, the lines of demarcation that we argued, where Texas begins and where United States says it begins and where Mexico says it begins. Okay, we'll talk about that in a bit. The first thing we're going to talk about right now is it's going to be a rough beginning, okay? Because as soon as we begin in 1845, then what's going to happen is that in 46 we're going to go to war with Mexico. We're dealing with Indians. We're also dealing with influx of immigrants coming in from Mexico and from other countries. Other countries. Well, other countries and other states in the Union, okay? And of course, the debt. And the debt is going to get taken care of in 1850 with a compromise of 1850, okay? That's when it's going to be finalized. But there's already the machinations of what is going to happen uh, in general to the idea of debt. That's going to be taken care of. The first major issue is going to be slavery. It's the first slave out. It's the first slave state outside of the Louisiana Purchase, so that's why you're going to get the Missouri Compromise later on. It's going to draw a line on. I think it's. I forgot the parallel. It's in the 30s, but I forgot it right now. I'm sorry. It's been a long day. Now, abolitionists in the United States are concerned with the spread of slavery, and that's going to be another reason of why the United States is going to be so eager to go to war with Mexico. Okay, now, the Missouri Compromise is going to resolve the temporary issue of slavery, which is going to move the boundary. And now, the Missouri Compromise is going to settle three things. Number one, it's going to allow slavery in the Louisiana Territory. It's going to move the line up to the 3630 line to include Missouri. Okay. Uh, in addition to that, what we're going to have is that it's going to allow territories to decide whether or not slavery is going to exist, and it's going to allow territories to decide whether or not slavery is not going to exist in their territory. So it's pretty ambiguous. Later on, the Kansas-Nebraska Act is going to come by, and it's going to, uh, I guess, overturn or invalidate the Missouri Compromise, because what's going to happen with Kansas-Nebraska is that we're going to go to the issue of popular sovereignty, and that's going to create another mess. Now, admission of Texas. we have it is the first territory outside of the Northwest Territory, and it is a territory outside of the Louisiana Purchase. The other thing is that Texas skips the a stage of being a territory. It doesn't have to accumulate enough people. In other words, it doesn't have to meet those quotas before it becomes a state. It just becomes a state. Now, what we're going to talk about now is the problems with statehood are going to be the U.S. Mexican War, and you are responsible to read up on the U.S. Mexican War. You have to understand that these lectures are not enough to make sure that you get a good grade on the exam. Okay, uh, you will also need to do some reading. Now, by this time, James K. Polk had already had a you know settlement with the Oregon Territory, and what we're looking at is we're looking at Mexican territory now. 1845 and 1846 are very busy years for James K. Polk, and he was one of the hardest working presidents uh, in the history of the United States. I mean, I don't care much for him, but he did work, and he was a one-term president. He promised that he would only be there 4 years, so he had to work really hard in order to get what he wanted done. Now, one of the first things that Polk does is that he wants to reach an agreement to where the boundaries are. Mexico said it was the Rio Grande. The United States said it was the Nueces River, which is actually about the Nueces is about 60 miles north of the Mexican border. If you're on I-35, Laredo to the Nueces would be about 150. No, it'd be about 200 about 250 miles from the point of Brownsville. From Brownsville on up, because yeah, it'd be about 250 miles in a straight line. Okay, so there's a considerable amount of territory there. By the way, that's the territory that I grew up in. Uh, now, Mexico was insulted by Polk when he sends John Slidell over there. Now, with that said, Slidell wasn't like the best candidate to send over there. His qualification was that he knew Spanish. Now, what's going to happen here, and I'm going to be very brief in this, okay, is that basically what happens is that Zach James K. Polk orders Zachary Taylor to go to Corpus Christi, and from Corpus Christi to go down to the north end of the Rio Grande. And what happens here is that Mexican forces cross the Rio Grande and they attack American soldiers. Polk says that's it. They declared war. We're going to declare war because they attacked American soldiers on American land. And it's like, well, no, there's a dispute. They were in disputed territory, okay? Now, Polk does get his declaration of war from 1840. And the war is 1846 to 1848. What does Texas contribute to it? Well, the Texas Rangers. They're sent back after incidents in Monterrey and Saltillo because Tyler can't control them. In addition to that, you have General John Coffee Hayes and Major Benjamin McCullough. Now, I'm not going to go into details of the U.S.-Mexican War. You can find a good video. It's relatively short. There's not a lot going on. It wasn't the cakewalk that the United States thought it was going to be. It's actually a 2-year war that is very costly. And in addition to it being very costly, a lot of people realize that the United States isn't as strong as they thought it was. The only reason that they're able to beat Mexico is because there's a lot of political infighting in Mexico. And the political infighting makes it very easy for the United States to lay inroads. The other thing that happens is that General Santa Anna does not listen, and it was his arrogance and narcissism that also. Now, would have Mexico eventually fallen? I don't know, because just what the number one killer of U.S. soldiers during the U.S. Mexican War uh, was disease. Okay, cholera or dysentery or things like that. So it was not. It was not. And when U.S. forces get to California, I mean, they take New Mexico fairly easy. But when they get to California, they almost lose there. And the Californios, what we call Mexican people that live in California, Californios, um, they're really tenacious, and they're very well educated for the most part. They're gentry, they're wealthy, so they have a really hard time. General Kearney, it's not a cakewalk for General Kearney. Okay, now down here we have Zachary Taylor, and what's going to happen to Zachary Taylor is that after Zachary Taylor signs um, a, a 3-day truce with Santa Ana, James K. Polk gets really upset at him and removes him from command and has him just stay in Monterrey, and then he sends Winfield Scott to come in through Veracruz. So you've got Kearney going in through California. Uh, you've got Zachary Taylor coming in through Texas, and then Saltillo and Monterrey, and that's as far as they go. Maybe Buena Vista, really as far as they go. And then you have Winfield Scott that comes in through Veracruz and takes Mexico. Mexico capitulates, and that's the end of the war. But there's a rift there. There's going to be some issues here because now the United States has a lot of territory that they've gained from Mexico for sure. We go all the way to the Rio Grande. We've got New Mexico. We got parts of Oklahoma, Kansas, Colorado, Wyoming. I mean, there's some issues here. Now, what's going to happen is that this is going to be settled in the Compromise of 1850. Okay, you got free soilers, you got pro-slavery advocates. You know, in New Mexico, Santa Fe, New Mexico reject claims uh, um, to say that, in other words, Texas really wanted Santa Fe. Santa Fe, uh, uh, Santa Fe, New Mexico declared that those claims that Santa Fe belongs to Texas are erroneous. Okay, I kind of wish they had, but it didn't work like that. Right, it would have made Texas a bigger state, and we would have had Santa Fe to be part of Texas. Now, they begin to organize counties in New Mexico, uh, and then New Mexico applies for statehood. Okay, and the reason that it was easy to for New Mexico to get out of it uh, from under the idea that Texas uh, wanted, or that Santa Fe belonged to Texas. I'm sorry, I've kind of lost my train of thought, and I'm trying to get myself refocused. Is that New Mexico had belonged was by itself as when it was under Spain. It was not part of the province of Coahuila y Texas. It was a province of Nuevo Mexico. So that's why people in New Mexico said, no, we don't belong to Texas. There was another Mexican state in between Texas and New Mexico, and that's Coahuila. There you go. I finally got it all out. Now, the border dispute is solved by the Compromise of 1850. All right? And so is the debt. So the boundary between New Mexico and Texas is finally solved. And it's quoting David Kingskill, it's right? Straight line, straight line, straight line, straight line, Red River, straight line, Sabine, right? And there you have it, right? In addition to that, Texas was given $10 million to pay their debts, and the monies west out of the settlement areas were deeded to Texas and to university funds. And you have the creation of the University of Texas at Austin in 1850, and that's why the University of Texas at Austin is so incredibly wealthy, because ranches like the XIT or the 10 in Texas, those ranches were bought, but at the end of the day, a lot of their mineral rights and their owners said that when they cease to exist, those lands go back to the University of Texas. I mean, that sounds kind of cool to me if you ask me. Southerners determined to preserve slavery create secret organizations. Um, and believe it or not, they wanted to create a slavery empire south of San Antonio, but it doesn't work out for them. You have some Knights of the Golden Circle that are in San Antonio and other organizations that promote slavery. The greatest advantage of being a state, you get federal funds. The Army forts, you don't have to worry about, you don't need your National Guard. Texas moved to Native American land. That means they get protection, so Texans then start taking more Native American land. And the United States government is going to set up a reservation system beginning in 1859, with the Alabama Cushara being the most successful. Okay, there's still a lot going on here. Okay, uh, the Indians are always going to get marginalized. Ethnic groups at this time enslaved in Texas. There's a great migration after annexation. You see a lot of people that write on their walls with charcoal GTT, gone to Texas. Many of them bring their slaves with them. Some slaves do come in from the northern states, but most of them are from the south, okay? As the Civil War approaches, the number of slaves in Texas begins to increase. Most are field hands, and of course, it was a very, very violent institution because slave owners had to protect their investment. And how else do you do it? You do it through violence. When people say, we want to. I attended a lecture one time when these guys were saying we have to learn how to teach slavery without violence, and it's like that's like trying to teach kickboxing without kicking. It doesn't go hand in hand. The only way that these individuals were able to control these slaves was via violence. Okay. Now, family life was crucial for Texas slaves. In Texas, they did allow married slaves to stay together. Number one, the amount of land, very big state, a lot of land to cover. And number two, marriage and reproduction, or marriage would lead to reproduction, thus meaning that there would be more field hands to work the fields, okay? They also allowed them to practice religion because they felt that that was center to their family core or nuclear family. Now, what about the Tejanos? What about the Mexican Texas or the Mexican Americans? Well, we suffered because of the U.S. Mexican War. A lot of individuals that were unable to provide immediate proof of their land claims lost their lands. Newcomers also brought racial bias with them. So even if the ones that were already here were okay with the Mexicans, a lot of them that came did not like them. Had no reason to like them. And a lot of the ones that came in, like the Germans and the Poles and the Czechs, they don't approve of slavery. So Texas is going to become really, really politically charged, just like it is now. Okay. In addition to that, you're going to have wars where Mexican American or Tejanos are going to challenge Anglos economically. In South Texas, you're going to have cart wars where Mexican Americans were moving freight, like the way they do now through 18 wheelers, and they would move goods for an X amount of money. Anglos come in, so the Mexicans would charge less. Sorry, I had to yawn there. So that was an issue. You have wars going on between these individuals, but the Anglos had the protection of the state government. Thus is going to give rise to vigilantes like Juan Cortina, okay, or it's going to give rise or recognition to the towns of Laredo, Texas, where it was predominantly Mexican, and those were, San Antonio was an Anglo stronghold. Laredo was a um, Tejano stronghold. Later on, McAllen becomes an Anglo stronghold. You know, those areas that uh, where a lot of these Anglo farmers will come in to raise citrus and other cantaloupes and other crops. Okay, now in addition to that, the most significant immigrants are German, as I said before. They were persecuted by whites for being anti-slavery. Most of them came to Texas after Texas became a state. They all settled in the Texas Hill Country. That's why we have a great smokehouse industry, sausage, barbecue, you name it. I'm not going to say that they're the only ones that did it, but that's the way it is. Also, you have the creation of the polka, the Mexican polkas. Um, they are part of the Fisher Miller land grant in the Texas Hill Country. And you have some Poles that arrive after 1854 and some Czechoslovakians, and then you have some Wendish and some Swedish people that come in right around the mid 1850s. Most of these groups try their best to maintain their culture and heritage, and the diversity of the Texas population before the Civil War was very, very diverse, and it was very unique, okay? Now, immigrants from southern states, as I said before, were the most influential of all of the classes. Usually, they were the major classes in Texas were planters, farmers, urban population, poor whites, and then you have free blacks. Okay, planters were the ones that had the best opportunity. They had free land. Their lifestyle was better than everybody else's. They lived in large homes with good clothing, servants, a lot of social gatherings. Cotton was the most important crop of the time. 25% of Anglo families in Texas owned slaves, where in the rest of the United States only 10% owned slaves, okay? And out of those 10%, only like maybe 3% actually own more than 10. So Texas, there's a reason why they call it the empire of slavery. 3%, and in Texas, 25% own Anglos own slaves, but the number was still the same as in the others. Only 3% own more than 20. Okay, now slave owners control about 3/4 of the wealth in Texas. There you go again. The wealthy people control all the wealth. Control all the money, and farmers were the second ones. The problem with them is that their life depends on the climate. Most of the farmers were subsistent. Most farms were from 120 to 160 acres. Some they used for cultivating, some they used for livestock. But only some farmers raised livestock. Okay, the principal item of raising at this time was sheep and hogs. Sheep, hogs, goats, and then cattle. Okay, life was very difficult on the farm, right? No air condition, no heating, no running water, no plumbing. The urban population increased slowly as infrastructure increased. Merchants, professionals such as doctors, lawyers, accountants, that kind of stuff, engineers, then the bulk of the craftsmen, and then the trade centers and the service centers. The largest cities in Texas, believe it or not, San Antonio, Galveston, Houston, and Austin. Okay? We do not have the rise of Dallas and Fort Worth until we get the railroad. Once we get that railroad up there, you're going to have Dallas grow. Since the railroad did touch Houston, Galveston, and San Antonio, the Henderson Railroad touched Houston and Galveston. That's why you're going to get larger growth there. Texas, for the most part, resisted urbanization. The A very small percentage of the people lived in the urban centers. More people lived in the country, but that's going to change. Not anytime soon, but it's going to change right at the end of World War II and after World War II. Starting with the Depression, it's really when it starts. Uh, Poor whites did not own land. All right, they were frontiersmen in the West. In the East, they were laborers. They were hoping to acquire land, and they would work in many different jobs. Maybe some were hog farmers. It all depended. Free blacks were the least populous. There was only about 400 free blacks in 1850, but because of the legal restrictions in the state, they were not able to flourish. And they also represented a threat to the institution of slavery and a threat to poor whites. Women, well, males were dominated the society in Texas. Women did not forfeit their personal property when they got married, though, because we still have a lot of old laws from the Spaniards left behind. And in addition to that, they had the right to get a divorce, but not necessarily the custody of the children back then. The main responsibility was the work in the family, rearing children, in the garden. Childbirth was the most dangerous thing that a woman could come across, or be subject to a very high mortality rate, not during childbirth, but due to infection. Okay, the fevers after childbirth. Okay, Texas still has one of the highest infant mortality rates and mortality rates for women, okay, that give birth. Now, religion, Texas was considered sinful. Uh, it had more denominations than any other state in the Union. The most prominent, Methodist and Baptist. Most African Americans were Methodist at this time. Ministers in Texas supported slavery. Now, we do have a lot of religious schools that emphasize religion in their learning. You're going to have Baylor, you're going to have TCU, you're going to have SMU, you're going to have Texas Wesleyan, you're going to have seminaries, you're going to have a bunch of religious schools, St. Mary's, Incarnate Word. I mean, I can sit here and go on, but I'm not going to. Public education was more hope than reality, okay? It's still like that. We lag behind in education. We just don't like to do that. Land was set aside. Land was dedicated to be set aside in 1850. Finally set aside in 1858. The University of Texas opens its doors in 1883. But it becomes a university, I think it's 56 or something. 55, I think. I forget. Uh, Violence was harsh in Texas. Frontier life, slavery violence, Indian attacks, vigilantes, Judge Roy Bean, duelings in Texas, political parties like the Whigs and the American Know Nothings and the Democratic Party. They're all fighting with each other, but at the end of the day, the Democratic Party prevails. It's not the Democratic Party of today. Okay, and even the Democratic Party back then breaks up. The Southern Democrats and then the Union Democrats, and they elect Ham Houston for governor in 1859. Slavery was the most prevalent issue. You're going to have problems in Texas in the summer of 1860 in the Dallas area. You're going to have, causes, it being slavery. Some saw Texas trouble as a plot to incite a slave insurrection. That just like people are going around all the time saying that they're going to do this and they're going to do that to start a revolution. It's the same thing that was going on at this time. That there was a lot of people out there that we felt were just pandering and trying to get a revolution going. Now, the election of 1860, an overwhelming majority of the people in Texas voted for the Democratic candidate. Of course, the Democratic candidate does not win. Uh, John Breckinridge does not win, and Lincoln wins the election, and southern states begin to secede. Texas is in the first round of secession. Unionist Governor Houston says does not want to secede. Houston refuses to call a special session, and secessionists take actions. They have a special session and they meet in January 28th of 1861, if I'm not mistaken, and they draft the Ordinance of Secession. Unionists attempt to delay it, but it's inevitable, and the Ordinance of Secession is passed between at a number of 166 to 8. What they do here is that they ask Union troops to leave, and they seize federal property. Um, in addition to that, you're going to have what happens to Houston is that he is removed. He moves that they become an independent republic, and they don't. Texas passes an ordinance uniting Texas with the Confederate States of America, and the convention declares Governor Houston no longer the governor and the office vacant. Now, Houston's political career comes to an end. Then they replace Houston with Lieutenant Governor Edward Clark, and Houston is going to die in 1863. Okay, now a lot had changed in these years. A lot has been going on, and with that said, I mean, there's only so much that Texas could bear. Uh, now, this concludes the lecture. What I'm going to do is I'll upload this one and then I'll record the Civil War. I more than likely am going to allow you to do reconstruction on your own. I'm not completely sure yet. I may just do it. Reconstruction is a quagmire, okay? Maybe I can get Professor Lundberg to do the reconstruction lecture for me because it's really hard. I understand it, but I don't know how to lecture it without getting the students tangled up. All right, you all be kind to each other and be sure and wear your masks. Okay.